Sprina Salvati. Doobie doobie doo. Doobie doobie doo. Doobie doobie doo. Doobie doobie doo. I'm your host, Sprina Salvati. Doobie doobie doo. Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. What is going on? Shout out to everyone watching on Rockfin. Shout out to everyone watching on YouTube in the chat. I have a very special guest today. He's been here before. His name is Shahid Buttar. He's an activist. He's a civil rights attorney, but most of you probably know him best as Nancy Pelosi's opponent. Welcome, Shahid.
So good to be with you, Sabby. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks so much for coming back on. So
your intro track is dope, by the way. That's I feel like I'm in very illustrious company having seen the montage of your previous guests. So,
oh, thank you. I have to give a shout out to Roar Media. They made that, and Jesse Jett actually made the song.
Nice. It's great production all the way through.
All right, Shahid. So, let's go ahead and get started with what happened this morning. I think a lot of us saw this I actually first saw it on Twitter this morning. Colin Powell passed away. I have to be careful how I talk about the 1-9 on here. So just FYI, I'll call it the 1-9 or I'll call it the jab. So I want to get your input on that because this is an example of someone who got the jab, passed away from the 1-9. And some of the responses I saw on Twitter from progressives, I guess I should not be surprised considering who they are. But to me, it was just outright appalling. I want to get your take on Colin Powell because from what I remember about Colin Powell, I did not consider him to be a good person.
He was an apologist for, he was a salesperson actually for wars. To say he was an apologist implies that he only, apologized after the fact, which he frankly did. But he was a key, critical, crucial player in helping not only drag our country into a war in Iraq, which left millions of people dead, created a whole host of problems in that region, which we are still trying to contain 20 years later. But people forget that well before that, 30 years before that, Colin Powell got his start in Vietnam. And he helped spin the My Lai massacre. That's why he was elevated through the ranks. The reason he was in a position to sell the Iraq war was because he had previously helped cover up a massacre by U.S. armed forces in Vietnam. And this pattern of helping spin to the public facts that are grievous when finally confronted, I think does demand some accountability. And, it's been a long time coming. I wish, frankly, that it weren't posthumous. I'm, on the one hand, grateful that he cracked some glass ceilings demographically, and that's worth celebrating. But at the same time, people who violate human rights and who help defend human rights violations and cover them up and who benefit from them and whose careers are built on them deserve to be called out for it. And unfortunately, he's far from the only one. If I had anything in particular, I would say that his entire generation of military leaders maybe didn't play the same role that he did, but many of them marched to the same drum. And there's, as long as we're dragging Colin Powell for, and holding him accountable for his serial, frankly, lies to the public, there are any number of others who we should probably include in the bucket, many of whom, like him, are being celebrated by Democrats outrageously.
Yeah. I mean, Obama's a big one. I want to show you what I saw earlier today. This really, really disturbed me. I'm going to share my screen really quick. So this came from... You guys have got to see this. So this came from Jamal Bowman, and this was what he had to say about Colin Powell. So here we go. As a Black man just trying to figure out the world, Colin Powell was an inspiration. He was from New York City, went to City College, and rose to the highest ranks of our nation, sending love, strength, and prayer to the family and friends of Secretary Powell. Rest in power, sir. And I responded to this. I did a quote retweet and I said, again, find other inspirations. I want to get your take on this, Shahid, because Jamal is one of the ones, he's a part of the squad. And I've incredibly been like disappointed by the squad. Whether it was through Force the Vote, voting to fund Capitol Police more, Iron Dome, which happened recently. I've just been really disappointed. And now to see like Jamal Bowman say that he was an inspiration or Colin Powell was an inspiration to him, I'm like, you couldn't have found any other man that was an inspiration?
Yeah, it is disappointing. I will say this, on the one hand, there are certainly many people to be inspired by in the world, and I do also wish that Jamal found other sources of inspiration. On the other hand, if Colin Powell is the person that for him as a young black man resonated, I don't begrudge him that, but I do think that if he's going to celebrate the legacy of this person who inspired him, it's worth also noting the facts. And he was more than just a person who inspired Jamal. He was also a person with a footprint in the world. And it's a footprint in the world that he deserves to be held accountable for. And it's one that too few voices, certainly too few with Jamal's platform, are willing to observe. On the broader issue, just thinking about the squad, its relationships to power, the critique of them, my general line here is that the squad is acting however we might choose to evaluate their tactical and strategic decisions in the context of a landscape set by particularly Nancy Pelosi as the leader of Democrats in the House. She is the arbiter, effectively, for all intents and purposes within the Democratic caucus. And so they are acting within a context that she sets. And I would love for them to be outspoken about the opportunity to replace her, either as the speaker, that was the force the vote moment, or in her seat, that was the opportunity that our campaign presented last year, which none of them, saw fit to embrace. I do think, in particular, while I am a offensive sort of frontal assault on the corporate leadership of the party, it is disappointing to see so many other would-be potential allies, unfortunately, under its thumb. So the way I respond to critiques of the squad is to say, usually, if you're concerned about them, let's remove the driver of the bus that they are under. And that's the person I happen to be challenging. So I aim to be very helpful here. When Jamal says something like this, though, about Colin Powell, that's an own goal. Pelosi didn't get him to say that, right? So I said my normal defense of the squad here and attempt to channel constructively that very legitimate grassroots outrage, I can't even apply that here because this is something that he just did sua sponte in the law of Latin for just like on his own, like of his own accord. And I don't think that I'm not going to say there's not a defense of it, because again, if Colin Powell inspired Jamal and that's what he wants to talk about, that's great. But as a public official, he should be mindful of the implications of his statements, both what he omits from the occasion. And, someone who I do think Jamal stands for human rights, or at least wants to, and this is an opportunity for him to do that in practice. And, he chose a different route that was much more about praising power holders. And I do think that the celebritization of our politics is a great part of our problem. And whether it's members of the squad or whether it's Colin Powell, none of these people should be treated like icons. Right? I mean, they're supposed to be public servants. I mean, I am auditioning to be a public servant, and I would like to see people, recognize that context as they're operating. And Jamal is not just a young man inspired by someone; he's also a young man who is inspired by someone who happened to have a very grievous, indefensible legacy, and it deserves to be observed.
Agreed. Let's talk about Nancy Pelosi for a bit. One of the things I've been telling, I've been telling my audience is that Nancy Pelosi didn't even have to debate you. And I remember the first time you came on and you told me that really sat with me for a while as to
thank you.
How was that even allowed?
Right? Tell me about it. I mean, it really does. And that's the tip of the iceberg. And I'll put this on really thick. If San Franciscans voted for Congress aligned with their ideologies as expressed in the presidential primaries, I would be in the seat now. But the fact that so many San Franciscans have no idea how we're represented in Washington is a reflection not just of the smoke and mirrors and political theater and spin moves that Nancy Pelosi plays. And I'll talk about a KQED forum last week that demonstrates this in just a second, but also the active complicity of the press. And this is one reason why I'm so excited by the emergence of voices online like yours and other hosts in the Fred Hampton leftist community, because there is a dire crisis in journalism. And you can see it when the records of incumbents never get covered, right? The fact that Nancy Pelosi has been a conservative gatekeeper impeding effectively every progressive reform over the last generation, from the fight to raise the federal minimum wage, to the fight for social housing, the fight for universal health care, climate justice, immigrant rights, peace and justice in the face of militarism. On every one of these issues, civil rights abused by predatory policing, on every one of these issues, labor rights, she's been an obstacle, frankly. And I want to offer two outliers on labor rights and civil rights abused by police. She did, frankly, change positions last spring, notably in the period between which I won the top two primary and I was targeted by a character assassination by her operatives in the Democratic Party. And so when we were on the ballot against her, we, as a lever, I would say, I think it's ultimately the social movements and the labor movement that pushed her. But the first time I ever saw her show up for those movements and policy was the first time she ever faced a Democrats who were left on the ballot. And I think of that as, there's lots of ways to read that. You might take away from that a really cynical view that, like, okay, these corporate politicians are useless unless we push them. And that's true. It is, in fact, true. Charitable, because I think they're worse than useless unless we push them. They're actively destructive to our communities in the future. But the more hopeful, perhaps, the more optimistic, the more constructive maybe way to look at that is that we actually have managed to push them. And I would say the 6 issues where we managed to force Pelosi to change positions last year, every one of those was a bigger victory than what I set out for. Right? I mean, I set out to capture a seat. We won 81,000 votes to replace her. And yes, it's more votes than anyone's ever won against her. But the thing that really forces me to run again is that we won a bunch of policies that passed the House of Representatives that she opposed until she couldn't anymore. And that, every one of those to me was a victory, and a victory far beyond me. And I'm humbled by it. I'm proud of it. I'm grateful to all our supporters for making it possible. And I do think, frankly, I see her still in Washington playing this same game. Let's talk about that KQED forum if I can for a second. She showed up in a live forum last week, and it's very rare that she shows up in live forums, just to be clear. She hasn't debated anyone since 1987, to go back to where we started this question, okay? I mean, it's just ridiculous. So she shows up in this forum, and the KQED journalists, when they have the Speaker of the House, rare opportunity to ask her questions, and what do? They show clips of all of her moments of theater, the ripping the speech, the glasses with the red coat, the pointing across the table, and they invite her to explain each of these moments, just like ducking into the punch of the political theater, like just taking any pretense of adversarial journalism and just throwing it to the wind. And this sort of like hagiography, stenography, it's a poor substitute for journalism. And that's why, frankly, the district has no idea how we've been represented for 30 years. I find myself as a challenger to that entrenched incumbent. Ultimately, I'm waging a battle against many layers of entrenched disinformation, and it is reinforced by the press. Again, that's why I'm so grateful you're here.
Yeah, thanks so much. There were Medicare for All activists that came on recently, and they were telling me about the next event that they have planned this month, and they're going to be protesting outside Nancy Pelosi's house.
On the 30th? I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So the vision here is to deliver coffins to her house to commemorate the hundreds of thousands of Americans who have died because we uniquely in the industrialized world deny the universal human right to healthcare. And that is very uniquely a product of her governance. She's, again, the arbiter in the House for all intents and purposes. And she is the reason that the House has never voted on a policy favored not only by bipartisan majorities across the United States, but every industrialized country on this planet. And it is shameful that this city's voice, like here's the thing that really enrages me whenever I think about this. Like, it would be one thing if Nancy Pelosi represented like Pensacola, Florida, or, Galveston, Texas, or, some dyed in the wool red district, or even maybe a purple district, like, someplace in downstate, Illinois, or maybe but it doesn't make sense for someone with a voting record as conservative as hers to represent a place that at least prides itself on being as progressive as San Francisco. Now, I've discovered San Francisco is a lot less progressive than it, would like to think, or certainly that I thought. I've discovered strands of, frankly, the worst racism I've ever encountered in my life here in the political establishment, particularly defending Pelosi. But setting that aside, it is shameful for our city, where the United Nations was founded, to be represented in Washington by the leader of Democrats in Congress, who not only has taken affirmative action to deny the universal human right to healthcare, but in a number of other contexts has been decidedly unhelpful, particularly to human rights. And that tension, that contrast between the United Nations being founded in San Francisco 70 years ago, and then today, our city being represented in Washington by someone who is 15 years deep into a continuing cover-up of CIA torture, someone who could legitimately be detained abroad and potentially prosecuted for failing to disclose it as she is required under international law. Someone for whom the press will never note that conflict of interest. And, at the same time, the press doesn't note this conflict of interest, and she's 15 years deep into the cover-up. Every time Ilhan Omar speaks up to say, hey, maybe we should acknowledge human rights, what does Pelosi do? She swats at her, with the entire force of the Democratic establishment. And there are consequences to this deference to power. And I'm not afraid to call it out. There was a phase in my life where I said there was nothing they could do to me. And I kind of thought that was true. And I discovered there are a lot of ways to counterattack someone who might not need any favors from the establishment, but they're going to have to shoot me to shut me up ultimately. And yeah, that's all there is to it. I see corruption in this city particularly as unacceptable, because San Francisco deserves to be represented by someone who stands for our city's principles instead of standing against them time after time after time.
I'm going to come back to something you mentioned about San Francisco in reference to racism in the party, but I have a couple super chats. I want to give a shout out to KRTD Media. Have you ever considered running third party instead? It's a jungle primary and you have the name recognition to do it.
Super thoughtful question. Yeah, I appreciate KRTD Media for raising it. So I was a registered Green for 15 years. Most of my adult life, I've been part of the Green Party. I strategically re-registered as a Democrat in 2018 in order to capture this seat, recognizing that to win a citywide office in San Francisco requires being part of the party that has the vast majority of registered voters. Now, there are some scenarios under which that might shift. And I'll note, just to respond very directly to the question, that I've had conversations with other parties, and I am frankly open to representing other parties. Now, the issue for me to some extent turns on who has juice, as it were. And there are a bunch of parties on the left that I would like to see have a greater presence. They include the Greens, they include the People's Party, they include the Working Families Party. I'd love for each of those communities to have a heavier footprint here. And I don't know if running third party as a congressional candidate challenging the leading Democrat is the way to establish them, because ultimately, frankly, the only way for the message to land nationally is if we remove her from within the party. Does that make sense? It's a different message if we replace her from a beyond the party challenge than it is if we do it within. And I would like to, frankly, do more than simply win a seat in Congress. And that's the opportunity that her seat affords. Another scenario to lay out here, there's been a lot of rumors about her potential retirement. Now, I want to just lay out a couple of facts here. So she has pushed back on any rumor to this point suggesting that she will retire. It is a potential possibility. And if she does, two different news outlets, first, I think it was the LA Times and then CNN, or maybe the other way around, but they've both reported that should Pelosi retire, her family's likely move is going to be to run her daughter, Christine, in her stead. Now, I'm outraged enough by bipartisan corporate rule and bipartisan authoritarianism and the co-optation of San Francisco's progressive voice by a relative conservative in Washington. When you add the outright feudal aristocracy of wealthy white families handing out congressional seats to their wealthy white kids, I have a problem with that, both as an immigrant and as a constitutional lawyer, let alone as a challenger. And I recognize that should that be the play that they try to run, they're going to have all the name recognition. They're going to have all the fundraising networks. They'll have the establishment's backing, but not the power of incumbency. And so I recognize the opportunity there to destabilize that handoff and to capture the seat in the interim. If Pelosi retires, I frankly expect about a gazillion people to get in this race, including every establishment Democrat who's ever held elected office in San Francisco. And in that case, I very will likely disaffiliate from the Democratic Party, because it would make sense in that context to do it. If in any other context, as much as I would like to see other parties establish a footprint, if I were to change my party affiliation without a bunch of Democrats splitting the Democratic vote, it would be effectively like declaring my candidacy to be a mere protest campaign. And I'm not running just as a protest, like I'm running to capture the seat and to shift policy. And the only way to do that in San Francisco in a one-on-one race is as a Democrat.
Gotcha. Illustrative Carp said, I've been thinking lately that maybe we should be asking for national single payer health care, and then the compromise would be Medicare for all. Thanks so much for the super chat.
It's not crazy. I mean, just to be rigorous about it, my impression is that Medicare for all is an example of single payer healthcare. Now, single payer encompasses lots of different models. It could be like an NHS system. So maybe that's what Illustrative Carp is suggesting. Like, if we had a British NHS system where not just, so in other words, Medicare for all would socialize the insurance layer, but it would leave delivery of healthcare services in private hands. So there's a single payer for healthcare. It's the government. You still get to choose, do you want to go to this clinic, this hospital, that private practice, and they're all independent. A national NHS system, like a national health service of the sort they have in Britain, is that the service delivery, in addition to insurance, are nationalized. And if to the extent Illustrative Carp is suggesting that we should propose that and fall back to just socializing the insurance layer, it's not crazy. I would, one reason not to pursue it that way is that socializing the delivery layer also comes at a cost. Two in particular. One of them is patient choice. Medicare for all, we can correctly frame as expanding patient choice, because when we socialize the insurance layer and leave the delivery layer in private hands, people gain effectively infinite choices as to how to fill their health care needs. When we nationalize the health delivery layer, that no longer becomes true. That puts us into the world where we start playing into some of the right-wing attacks about, waiting lines, for instance, or, the most brutal version of this is if you're talking to a military veteran who might not favor Medicare for all or universal health care. They have a very compelling reflection, and it is simply, have you been to the VA? Would you want that for everyone? Hell no. And so then it becomes this whole, question of how do we fix that? And so if nationalizing the health delivery system becomes VA for everyone, I don't know if anybody wants that from a functional standpoint, just because it's under-resourced. It's, I've heard from vets that they feel when they go to the Veterans Administration as if they're being treated like prisoners or inmates rather than veterans. And it's heartbreaking, frankly, to hear the stories about people being underserved, particularly people, and I want to make this sharp in the context of the pharmaceutical industry. If we're going to, so many untied strands here. If we're going to socialize another layer beyond insurance, I would start with pharmaceuticals before healthcare delivery, because pharmaceuticals present a quite compelling case for nationalization. And when you look at the VA, you can see one of the ways how people are familiar with the Sacklers and their role in pushing Oxycontin and the different opioids. You have all these veterans coming back from armed conflict in the theaters that they signed up for, often through the poverty draft to, serve our nation's interests or defend it, as they were, probably told by a recruiter. They come home, they're suffering from any number of challenges, and a bunch of them, many of them, entirely too many of them, get hooked on painkillers to fill someone's pockets. And there are so many, there's all kinds of research into alternative treatments that do not rely on opioids. Everything from cannabis, for instance, to psychedelics have had incredible success in treating PTSD in a range of indications, including veterans. And yet we see these treatments being widely denied veterans, largely because there is this centralized apparatus of healthcare delivery to which they're basically subjected. And so before we socialize the healthcare delivery system, I would be much more in favor of putting pharmaceuticals in the health insurance bucket. So if we want a target beyond health insurance to implicate in order to make a reform focused on health insurance more palatable, I would encourage people to focus on the pharmaceutical industry as the next target in line for any number of reasons. But hopefully that responds to the question.
Yeah, my dad had horrible experience with the VA for years. Filing for disability, it should never take that long. It should never take that long for paperwork to go through. So I'm very much familiar with the VA. There needs to be work there. There needs to be things done. You mentioned something about San Francisco and racism in the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I had this experience as well because I moved to Massachusetts from a red state. I was living in South Carolina. I went to college there. That's how I got there.
Okay.
And and I was a Democrat at that time. This was years ago. And I remember at that point in time, the type of racism that I was familiar with was actually overt racism. That was what I was used to seeing, like in the South, in red states. And then I moved to Massachusetts and I was like, I'm going to a blue state, man. Everybody's Democrat. This is going to be great. And then I got here, and after living here for a while, I realized that the Democrats here were racist too, but this was more like covert racism. So they weren't as overt about it. It was things like having a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, but they don't want you living next door to them. They don't want you in their neighborhood. Going to the bars. I don't know if you ever been to Boston, but like going to a bar in Boston and you're one or two Black people in the bar, and all of a sudden the bartender is very attentive until the Black people come to the bar. All of a sudden the bartender doesn't see you and just looks away. It's things like that. It's not as obvious, but it's still there.
When this insidious emergence of stale patterns that people think that they're over it's not a recent phenomenon. Like, this has been the case, right? James Baldwin actually shot an entire documentary about racism in San Francisco in the 60s called Take This Hammer. And his central thesis was, you think this city is not racist? It's like the most progressive city in the country. Oh, well, let's explore and examine and unearth the racism that pervades here. Here in San Francisco in particular, I'd say it's most visible in housing. We have had among the most vicious gentrification waves in the country in this city over the last decade. It is so profound that the racial composition of our city has demonstrably shifted. We had something like a 12% African-American population in the 60s. It's down to 4%. And that is very much a product of relentless increases in housing costs. I mean, home ownership in San Francisco is effectively unattainable for someone who either is not in the tech industry or landed gentry, part of the aristocratic land ownership class. It's absurd. And even the rents here, they are the most expensive in the country. And they are, on the order of like close to $3,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment for the median price. And so just think about what that does for families. And most of the housing stock here, to the extent any has been built, has been luxury condos, studios, and 1-bedrooms for young working professionals, the tech cohort. And so families in San Francisco, even among wealthy people, get gentrified. So you've had this really pernicious dynamic in our communities that has hollowed out, to some extent, San Francisco, and left it, again, a differently composed city than it was in a different era. That's one example. Employment beyond housing, policing, certainly all of these arenas presented. I've encountered it most viciously in journalism, which is an absurd place to encounter public white supremacy, particularly when it's unacknowledged by its perpetrators. And, I'll take the liberty of naming them because I think it's appropriate at this point. Journalists, including Tim Redmond at 48 Hills, Joe Garofoli at the San Francisco Chronicle, Joe Eskenazi at Mission Local, Stuart Schuffman at Brokaw Stewart, all publishing stories about supposed misconduct that were flatly false, none of which were fact-checked, all of which were debunked, and all of their stories remain uncorrected still a year later. One of them, I forgot, Matthew Bajko at the Bay Area Reporter, he got an award for a story. This is absurd to me, and I really do think, I hope people acknowledge the importance of this. Matthew Bajko at the Bay Area Reporter published a story that included a written accusation of, this is a direct quote, sexual assault that was acknowledged as false by the author 2 months later in an interview with Ryan Grimm at The Intercept. The Bay Area Reporter story remains uncorrected to this day, and they just won an award for it last week from the San Francisco Public Press. I really don't know what to do about it. As an immigrant candidate in a racist city, confronting this circle of wagons among journalists who are unrepentant in their willingness to silence whistleblowers, willingness to ignore facts, willingness to indulge weaponized fabrication with open political motives to insulate a powerful political establishment. And I could actually make this sharper, but there are parts of this story that haven't broken publicly yet that multiple journalists are probing. So I'll let them speak for their findings as they release them, because some of this I didn't even know about. Journalists have been bringing things to me that I didn't even know, revealing layers to the orchestration of the character assassination campaign that attacked the 2020 election and was orchestrated to mislead voters ultimately. And I see this as not just the publication of disinformation and not just the publication of election disinformation, but the publication by the newspaper of record and many supposedly progressive independent news outlets of demonstrably racist election disinformation. And I do think that I am not ultimately the target. I was the subject, but democracy is the target. The voters of this city are the target. And while the 2020 election may have been compromised by it, I am very eager to defend the integrity of the 2022 election by exposing the network that continues to spread disinformation in San Francisco.
We have a question here from KRTD Media. We can't say his full name, but where do you stand on Julian?
I am all about the press freedom generally, and I see it here implicated in ways that even the press refuses to acknowledge. I've been outspoken about the illegitimate prosecution of Julian Assange for years, many years, long before running for Congress. I spent 6 years running a national nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee that was founded well before I was hired. I was still in law school when it was founded, and it was founded to fight the Patriot Act. And when I was leading the organization, we expanded its ambit to include any number of other related challenges, including executive secrecy. And I see the attacks, the prosecution of Julian Assange, ultimately as aiming to vindicate this principle of the executive branch's right to cover up military secrets. What he did was expose, people forget he gets often conflated with his work surrounding the Clinton email server and like that era of it. But if you rewind the tape 15 years ago, the reason Chelsea Manning was prosecuted and tortured is because she worked with WikiLeaks to expose evidence, including the collateral murder video. And I want to focus on this. This is a video that documents an Apache helicopter crew, U.S. Army, it might have been Marines, I think it was Army, gunning down 2 Reuters journalists. And nobody knew how it happened until the video came out. And the military did not disclose the video. WikiLeaks did. So Julian Assange is a publisher of information that is embarrassing to the U.S. military because it shows military crimes and cover-ups. The prosecution of Julian Assange is us shooting the messenger. It is that simple. And we shouldn't shoot the messenger. We should, just like in the cases of other whistleblowers, we should heed their revelations. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, whistleblowers like Ed Binney. Just to relate this to our previous conversation and the character assassination that I confronted last year, there are many whistleblowers. One of them, Gloria Berry, published her story that local journalists refused to confront. Whistleblowers deserve to be heeded because whistleblowers confront us with facts that inform the public conversation. When we vilify whistleblowers, whether it's chasing Edward Snowden into international exile or arresting Bill Binney with his one leg and a bath towel at 5 a.m. as he's trying to get out of the shower, or whether it's threatening Gloria Berry and hacking her computer and smearing her for standing up for the truth when this orchestrated network of corrupt party operatives were spreading their lies. In every one of these cases, shooting the messenger does no one any favors except the corrupt networks that are doing the shooting. And in the case of Julian Assange, that corrupt network is called the military-industrial complex. And there's so many layers here that are worth observing. When I say favorite, I mean, I hope you understand the context in which I mean this. In Britain, there was a decision about Julian about 6 months ago, maybe 4 months ago, and they denied an extradition request to the United States because specifically the British court said, we don't trust the American prison system to respect this man's human rights. It's that bad in this country. And there's so many Americans who refuse to acknowledge the reality of the fascism that has taken root in the United States. And when we have the country that we had to revolt from to establish our independence, acknowledge that our human rights record is so unacceptable that they don't trust us with their prisoners, that's something that we in the United States might take some alarm at. And I certainly have. I mean, I've been alarmed at this for 20 years. I've seen this just grow. And, to KRTD's media's question, it's not just Julian either. The attacks on press freedom are wide ranging. Every one of the recent administrations have attacked the press. Obama, under Obama, the Justice Department was essentially wiretapping Associated Press journalists. Particularly if you think about the crackdown on whistleblowers, that is a crackdown on the press, right? One reason that they vilify whistleblowers is to keep them out of the press. And so attacks on whistleblowers are an attack on press freedom, no less than the direct ones. And by that standard, we haven't had an administration friendly to press freedom in this country. I don't know if ever, certainly not in the last several decades.
No, I agree. Thank you so much, Oz, for the super chat. If running for office and electoral politics want policies benefiting the public, point out 3 policies that have a positive impact in a simple metric comparing the magnitude of the issues we face today. We may die in 10 years. Thanks so much for the super chat, Oz.
I'm trying to parse the question. It's a challenging one to grip. So I can point out 3 policies that have a positive impact, certainly. I don't know if there are several simple metrics that compare the magnitude of the issues we face, but I mean, to the point about dying in 10 years, the climate crisis is ultimately the central issue when we think about the long-term survival of our species, and it is appropriate to look through most other issues through the lens of how it might impact it. As long as we're naming 3 policies, so climate justice certainly is one of them. Militarism is another. It intersects climate justice in ways that we might discuss. It's a particular subject I like to emphasize at these intersections. And then third, if climate justice and militarism are our first 2, presuming that I can put decarceration in the demilitarism bucket, I'd make it our third one, if not. But if we can do the gloss of include that within militarism, then the third issue for me would particularly be human rights, including the human right to healthcare, and establishing a set of human rights that are expansive to include all basic human needs, not just housing and not just healthcare and not just education, but all of them. And those should be human rights. They're any basic human need. We have the resources in this country to provide basic needs as rights, and we don't. And that is a reflection of mislaid, unacceptable priorities. If we think about a metric, I think time maybe is the reason. And again, I'm not exactly sure if this is where the question went, but as I compare those issues, I do see that the climate crisis compels a certain urgency by virtue of the fact that we are effectively racing off a cliff. That is the current time slice reality. And so it is really urgent, and it is very much in front for me. Universal healthcare, frankly, not very much less so, because we are living in the middle of a pandemic. And just to be clear about this, we talked about this in the context of the action I'll be speaking at Pelosi's office next week. But there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who are dead right now because we don't acknowledge everyone's right to a doctor and medicine. And it's completely unacceptable. And that's the kind of thing that, again, we can compare that to the climate crisis in terms of urgency. I don't know if urgency is like the right metric, because if you're ill, it's pretty urgent to get to a doctor. Right. So part of this is about like macro, micro. I frankly don't like to compare them, particularly because the political obstacles to either policy are the same, which is to say, when we get to a point that we can win universal healthcare, we'll have the Green New Deal too. And we'll be able at that point to shrink the Pentagon, because frankly, Nancy Pelosi is an embodiment of the protection of each of those various contemporary institutions. And so in other words, when we manage to break the political inertia of the current stasis, all of these things will be on the table. And so to try to prioritize them, I think, does the establishment's work for it. And I would rather not do that. I'm eager to establish all of these priorities, and the intersectional movement to defend the future and defend our communities, I think ultimately will settle for nothing less than all of these various demands. And that's what I'm here for.
Awesome. I have to say something about Nancy Pelosi too, something that I discovered not too long after the first time you came on. But first, I want to shout out KRTD Media. This is a great interview. Keep up the great work. Good luck in your race, Shahid. KRT will definitely be reaching out to you. Sorry to send so many super chats.
Don't apologize. Thank you.
Thanks so much, KRT. So I found out that Nancy Pelosi, that her family had a relationship with the Kennedys.
It's why she endorsed Kennedy over Ed Markey in the Senate race last year. I mean, this is a fascinating story. I want to hear the rest of your thoughts here. I have a story that can link this to last year, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of digging, and I found out that her family had a relationship with the Kennedys. In fact, at one point, I guess she used to babysit for the Kennedys. And this all makes sense about these political dynasties, because obviously the Kennedys, they were a political dynasty. Nancy Pelosi, if I'm not mistaken, I believe her father was a politician in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's right. He was the mayor of Baltimore and a member of Congress. I didn't know she babysat for the Kennedys. That's wild. For real?
That's what I read. And that's why I'm asking myself, like, how old is Nancy Pelosi? So
Yeah.
this stuff goes way back, guys. This stuff runs so deep. And that's the thing I've always been trying to get across to you guys. Like, a lot of these people that are in these positions didn't get there just because they ran a good campaign.
Oh, Nancy Pelosi in particular. I mean, she is the embodiment of that privilege you're describing, more so than anyone in Congress, I dare say.
Yeah, it's like it's all about who you know. And so for me, like, to find that information out and to see that, and then to find out that, and I didn't know this at the time either, that Gavin Newsom is related to her.
By marriage, not by blood. But yes, absolutely. Another way of putting that is that family has the Speaker of the House, the Governor of California, and don't overlook the way she might not be blood related, but Kamala Harris is very much from the same political network, as is Dianne Feinstein. So from that political network, we have the Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, a senior U.S. senator, and the Governor of California, all from a very tight knit, closed circle from one city of under 1 million people.
I just can't. It's absolutely ridiculous. I want to get your takes on Kamala Harris, because she's from your state, and I heard bad things about her before she announced that she was running, about the things that she did in California, the truancy laws. I read about those, which she still in some way is kind of not taking credit for. I don't really understand what that's all about. And the fact that she was exploiting prison labor as well.
Yeah, Kamala Harris, particularly by the standards set by today's prosecutors, was no progressive at all. She was a traditional lock them up, throw away the key, frankly, an innovator in predatory prosecution. And that's, that was, as a prosecutor in her era, that's how you got by. I don't think that's a particularly good defense, but that's sort of her MO, that she came up as the DA in San Francisco. She was the Attorney General in state of California. In her very brief time in the Senate, I actually thought she did a better job then. That might have been the highlight of her political career. And I've seen, as the vice president, frankly, a continuation of the same sort of, for instance, when she talked about the stay in Mexico policy. So she's been, tasked with overseeing the administration's immigration policy. And her answer is to not come. The last time I checked, we carved in stone at the base of the Statue of Liberty an invitation to bring me your huddled, tired, poor, yearning masses yearning to breathe free. I was one of them. And so when I see the vice president of the United States, who herself has foreign blood, inviting people not to come, I find that offensive. And I do think of that as a grave abdication of a responsibility that she should be more careful with. I hope to see her more boldly embrace the issues demanded by we the people of the United States. I'll give her credit for running on the Green New Deal when she ran for president. I was grateful to see that. It was out of her character. I didn't expect it, but it indicated to me that she is something of a weather vane. And that's not a good thing in a politician, but it's an opportune thing for people in a politician, right? Because on the one hand, and this is our problem in capitalism, people who are weather vanes respond to where the power is blowing. And if it's all from Wall Street, you can predict what they do. Kamala has shown an indication that she recognizes that Wall Street is not the only direction from which the wind is blowing. And if that is the one thing we can say about her that is encouraging, I mean, I might just leave it at that, because it does suggest to me that as long as we blow the wind as a movement, she might conceivably show up on some issues. Now, do I think of her as an ally to the movement? Far from it. And if I go to, have the opportunity to serve in Washington, I intend to fight her and Biden from the left. But I also recognize the very profound difference between someone who is intransigent in their commitments and someone who calculates their commitments based on their own impression of what people want. And I see there an opportunity for us to pull or drag the vice president, if necessary, to recognizing the need, for instance, to put human rights at the center of our policy, which she decidedly has declined to do to this point.
Thanks so much for the super chat, Oz. Following up to the previous question, the metric point is electoral politics will not save us in time. Why feed what's killing us, the rigged electoral system?
But yeah, that's a thoughtful point. The electoral system is, its legitimacy is far from established. Let's put it that way. I don't want to call it rigged, because that's a little bit too flippant, because we see people flip seats. It happens. And I think it takes a lot of work. And to the point that I think Oz is getting at, if we flip a few seats, each year, there's a concern maybe that the climate crisis is going to proceed at a pace at which it's going to get out of hand. And I just want to make this clear. to think of the electoral system as a solution to anything, that's not the right frame. If we look at it through a harm reduction standpoint, at the moment, the goal is to just get the electoral system in a position where the policies aren't making the problems any worse, right? And we could have any number of mutual aid projects. We could organize all the workplaces. We could do all the direct action. And if we don't have any hooks into policymaking, none of the problems are going to get any better. I mean, that's just the unfortunate fact of the matter. Electoral politics is like the ninth inning of a baseball game. And you have to play the ninth inning. You have to play the first eight. I think a lot of people who are maybe just starting out in politics or, figuring out how all this stuff works, maybe seized on electoral politics as the most visible thing that they saw and are coming to the realization that there is more there, that it's not enough. And that's true. But to abandon the most visible thing because you're discovering all the rest of it is foolish at best. And I think perhaps, part of the sort of like establishment design in terms of neutralizing our movements. But at the end of the day, we have to do direct action. We have to do community organizing. We have to do mutual aid. We have to organize in workplaces, and we have to contest elections and win them and shift policy. And if we pretend that we don't, it is a quick ticket to an outcome that we can predict. And the impetus for impatience is one I completely understand. I just recognize it doesn't get us anywhere. And in the current time slice, we have to take action in every conceivable way at every level. And the electoral arena is a crucial one of those.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I fault myself for doing like, a couple years ago, is that I thought that electoral politics was the solution. And I like the baseball analogy. I like that one. But it's true. Like, one of the things that we've been telling people especially over at FHL, and I've told people here, is that some of these things that we're asking for, that we need help with, we can do ourselves as a community.
Right.
I'm 100% for a general strike. I think it needs to happen in this country. I think that the pandemic just pulled the cover off of things that a lot of us already knew were issues to begin with. And then we had the pandemic, and then it just amplified it, I feel, in a way. But I personally just feel like as long as corporations control the politicians, we're always going to have this issue. And this is something that, like, Glenn Greenwald refers to as the rotating villain.
Mm-hmm.
Is that if it's not, right now it's Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, right?
Yep.
If it's not them, then it'll be someone else that's the rotating villain. I can see that because I just feel like the corporations are the ones that have control of this country and not the government. I mean, I feel like Jeff Bezos has more control than the politicians that we elect in office. Shout out to KRTD Media. Are you willing to attack Joe Biden and Kamala Harris if you are elected, as well as other Dems? Thanks so much for the super chat.
I drag Biden all the time.
Yeah.
I'm not in any way hesitant to call out the errors of the administration. And for me as an immigrant, the complete failure to do anything transformatively helpful at the border is one of them. The Trump era rules are currently the objects of litigation by human rights groups that are suing the Biden administration in federal court. Rule 42, I believe, is the particular Trump era rule that is at issue in that litigation. But any number of issues beyond it, the simple fact that we practice the mass detention of immigrants in the first place is an illegal violation of international human rights. We don't have a right to detain people at the border. We have an obligation to let them in and then let them petition for asylum. And, this idea that we have made bipartisan a set of abuses that people might have thought were bad under Republicans, they're just as bad under Democrats. And I think of that as true, not only in the context of immigration, the military budget, in my mind, comes to mind, impunity for torture. Biden has a hand in that as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time when all that was going down. There are lots of issues where Biden presents really profound problems, and I'm not in any way hesitant to call them out.
What was one of the things that you've learned since you've seen, hold on, I got a little bit of an echo. What was one of the things that you would say you've learned? Because I sit back and I think about the 2020 elections, and I feel like I'm really bothered by the fact that I feel like you and Paula Jean Swearingen, like, I feel like you guys definitely should have gotten in. And I know a big part of that is the media, but I also have to ask myself, did any of the other members of the squad, did they endorse you? I know about our Paula Jean story, but did any of the members of the squad give you their endorsement? Because I know AOC did not endorse Cori Bush.
Right. No, not only did they not endorse me, but like none of them. And I want to give Cori credit because before she was elected, we did events together. And I know her from St. Louis. Like, you know, Cori at least has acknowledged me publicly at least once. And the others, you know, like they've literally run from me the one time I met one of them in public. They like don't want to be anywhere near me. And I kind of get it, you know, like I see where they're at. And I get that they feel chilled, timid, intimidated. I get where they're at. I am not intimidated. I'm frankly not intimidatable. Like, they can shoot me, but that's the only way they're going to shut me up. And, you know, when I see the squad, I don't want to say timidity because it's not, frankly, the right way to think of it. They're operating strategically within a landscape that the speaker sets. The other thing that's important to realize about the squad is that they don't vote as a block, which is to say Cori and Ilhan don't have a lot of backup, right? Like Cori and Ilhan will go to the mat. Each of them have taken hits for stepping out of where the establishment wants them to be. When Ilhan says we should respect the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, she pissed off everyone in the national security establishment because every one of them could find themselves in a trial before The Hague if we actually did that. People including Nancy Pelosi, which is why they started punching back at her. When Cori Bush occupies the steps of the Capitol to try to force some action on the eviction moratorium, people forgot that there, and then just to play out that saga, what then happened is Biden made some concessions. The Supreme Court intervened to strike them down. People forgot that the whole reason Cori Bush had to camp out in the first place is because Nancy Pelosi dropped the ball when it was in the House. And this serial process of power holders evading attention while the people who we would hope in the squad to challenge them don't necessarily have the votes and the cohesion to fight them off. In other words, when people in the force the vote moment, for instance, thought that the squad had the votes to deny Pelosi the speakership, they absolutely did not. They didn't have the votes. They might have if we thought that the squad all voted as a block, but it's a marketing slogan more than it is a legislative block. And I wanted the caveat to all this, frankly, is the Build Back Better agenda, because they held the line here in a way that was really impressive. And I want to give a huge shout out to Pramila Jayapal for holding the Progressive Caucus together at a time when there was a lot of pressure bearing on them to make concessions. And, you know, to see Biden making these concessions to Manchin, which seems to be the latest direction that this is breaking, it is not only disappointing, but it's a reflection of just what you were talking about before with the rotating villain. Manchin is just a scapegoat for the corporate Democratic Party. You mentioned Paula Jean. If the corporate Democratic Party was so concerned about Manchin, we could have gotten him out of office pretty recently, but the Democratic Party didn't back his challenger. So all these people that are pointing their hands at Manchin don't buy it. Every elected in Washington is complicit in keeping him there. And so the entire party ultimately is responsible for this, as much as they want to try to blame just Sinema and Manchin. It is a much more widely shared problem. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot I could say here about this tension between the left and the center. And at the end of the day, I think the real need is for us to define the agenda for the debate, because when we set the terms of the agenda, we ultimately win, whether we win seats or not. That's how the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed the House. That's how the Justice and Policing Act passed the House. If we're here for policy, there's a lot we can do by simply challenging, even in spaces where we might think that the climb is uphill. If the squad thinks it's an uphill climb to face Pelosi in Washington, try facing her in San Francisco with racist press insulating her, right? I know how challenging it is to face the Democratic establishment. No one has taken worse hits by it than I have. And I invite the squad to double down on that need to challenge power. And I want to everybody else watching, you know, there's a lot of ways to internalize this dynamic in Washington. And I've seen so many people watch the squad, acknowledge their challenges, their limits, and then throw their hands up in the air and be like, oh, electoral politics sucks. And I'm like, people, come on. You know, like, it's not like this just got invented last year. Like, have some sense of history here. You know, like, we are so much further forward than we were 5 years ago. And for people who refuse to acknowledge it, I would just say, like, look up, you know, like, or read a book, maybe. Like, the world was not built last week. And so for those of us who've been in the movement for a little while, I think it's quite frustrating to see all the nihilism that's set in by people who just internalize all the wrong lessons, I think, from very appropriate recognitions of the way that the power relationships are lining up in Washington. There's a history here. And if we acknowledge that history, I think there's a lot more progress to acknowledge than some voices seem to be willing to.
Um, I have a statement to say, and then I want to read Carity's super chat about endorsing third party candidates. I think some of the frustration comes from with the squad is because when they were running, like we believed that they were going to come in and kind of be like a left version of the Tea Party and go in there and really push back, you know, like especially when it came to the Capitol Police bill, like that one really, it just, why would you vote present or why would you vote to
Yeah.
give them more money? Now, I expected Ayanna Presley to vote the right way because I actually lived in her district when she ran the first time when I voted for her. I know her history here, so I expected her to vote the right way, and she did. But it comes across as somewhat performative because when I see AOC go to the Met Gala with this gown that says tax the rich and there's protests going on outside for Black Lives Matter, and I'm seeing cops like push people to the ground. Well, AOC used to be outside with the people, and
Mm-hmm.
now she's inside with the wealthy people, and she doesn't even acknowledge the protesters. So it's just like it makes us feel like, oh, you don't need us now because you're already in and you've turned your back on the people who voted for you, who put you there. So it's like when activists are going to run, we still expect you to be activists, even if you get in.
Right.
And I personally am not seeing that from the squad.
Well, again, I want to differentiate Corey and Ilhan versus the others, right? I'm not going to defend AOC. I'm not going to defend Ayanna. I'm not going to defend Jamal. I'm not going to defend Mondaire. They make their own decisions. Corey and Ilhan, they go to the mat and they take heat for it. And there have been instances. In fact, I think it was probably the Capitol Police bill. I think one of them. There are moments where I've been disappointed in one or another of them. But the point here I want to draw out is that it's not performative for them, and they demonstrate it. Anybody in the movement who thinks that Cori Bush or Ilhan are performative, I would invite you to walk 5 minutes in their shoes. And I don't think anyone would last. Just to be clear, like they are leaders and they are about it. They've paid profound prices for standing up for principles, and they don't deserve the critique that people hurl at the squad. Their colleagues might. But if everyone in the squad was Cori and Ilhan, we would not be having this conversation. It would be a completely different landscape in Washington. But they don't have a lot of backup. There is a difference between people who mouth support for policies and we who demonstrate it. And, I've been arrested in the Senate. I've been arrested here in San Francisco. I've been smeared by San Francisco establishment actors, including elected politicians. Like, we who pay prices for standing up for things, you can tell that we care because we are willing to take the heat. And Ilhan and Cori deserve recognition for that. And so I take some umbrage at people, again, with this blanket criticism of the squad as if there weren't differentiation among them. I don't think it's fair to blame Cori and Ilhan for the limits that their colleagues might feel. And I wish, frankly, that they were all bolder. I wish everyone in Congress were bolder. And as long as we're calling out the squad, let's just be real here and note that there are a lot of other Democrats too. And so when people single out the handful of most progressive members of Congress as if they weren't standing well to the left of literally hundreds of others who are problems, I think it just it gets to the point of farce because it's really easy to criticize the squad when there are all these other people, including most Democratic members of Congress, who aren't anywhere even remotely near them. And so I would like to see some appropriate accountability for actors rather than the displacement of concerns to the most visible potential targets. In other words, the celebritization of politics that is itself part of the problem. We see the movement fall into the trap by heaping all this critique on the squad because the squad is only just a handful of seats in Congress, ultimately. Pelosi even described them that way once, and I was offended at the time. From her frame of reference in the legislative vote counting process, she's right. And we as a movement have to acknowledge that. So to tear down the people who are our foothold in Congress, it is frankly just senseless. And I totally get that people want to see our voices in Congress be more assertive. I am with you. Absolutely. And I'm the first person to say it. I would love for them to shout me out, given that I'm trying to take out the person who's restraining all of them. But I recognize that they won't. Recognizing that they won't, my invitation to everyone else is to do what they won't, to take those steps, to run challengers against all of the incumbents. Don't heap the critique on the squad. Take out the whatever corporate Democrat is representing your district. It's too easy to critique someone in Congress for not showing up better when we have so many other voices who are actively part of the problem. And again, in the same way that so many people pointing out Manchin overlook the other people surrounding him, right, who enable him, the people who single out the squad also forget all of the people elsewhere and the occasion who are evading accountability while everyone's focused on the celebrities. Policymaking is not a celebrity-driven endeavor. And for movements to fall prey to this celebritization, taking our eyes off the ball of where the action is actually at, it makes us complicit in our own marginalization. And I would just hope that the movement can demonstrate greater sophistication than that. If we are, when I look at these issues, particularly like with the squads and intimidation in Washington, I see particularly the opportunity for the movement to put some heat under moderate Democrats, run primary challengers like me and Alex Morse and many of the other, Angelica Duenas in SoCal. There's so many challengers who present really profound opportunities to put different kinds of voices in. Jason Call, like if you put some of those voices in, I think you might start to see this dynamic, not just in discrete races, but in the policy making process shift. And we can see it right now in the Build Back Better agenda fight and the ways in which, again, Manchin is the roadblock in the Senate. But just think about where we are at in the House right now. We were never able to get stuff like this through the House a year ago. That's worth acknowledging. That is progress, whether it's as fast as we might like or obviously not nearly. And is it as fast as we need? No, because we're already living through a mass extinction crisis. So whether we're going to, I saw one of the questions earlier was about like, we're all going to die in 10 years, which is not, in fact, what the IPCC report said. But the point is, we are so far down this road already that the alarmism, if it impels us to inaction, we are doing the establishment's work for it. And this is no time to internalize that the game is rigged when we've actually managed to secure beachheads and victories, right? I mean, movements have to be smart enough to recognize victories when we attain them. And I feel like we have a habit of shooting ourselves in the feet. And I see that playing out a lot in a lot of the attitudes towards the squad and the unwillingness of people to look closer to home rather than at the celebrity on Twitter, who shows up in their feed a lot.
Okay, so I'm gonna read this question, but after I read this, there's something I want to say, and then I want you to answer this question if you can.
Okay.
If you are in office, will you be willing to endorse third-party candidates locally and in other states over Democrats if they are better? Thanks so much for that super chat, KRTD Media. But I gotta say this first, Shahid. I gotta push back a little bit on Ilhan. I gotta tell you
Please.
why.
Go ahead.
Because recently, Ilhan just had an interview. And she said if she was given the opportunity to meet someone, from Britain, that she would want to meet Margaret Thatcher. And to me, that was really appalling because Margaret Thatcher is, number one, she's a racist. Number two, she's a warmonger. Margaret Thatcher wanted to keep South Africa all white. Margaret Thatcher looked down on people from Ilhan Omar's country. So this is where the representation comes in. Because when you have someone like Ilhan Omar and everyone says, yay, we have all these minorities and people of color like being added to Congress now. Yes, but if they are going to get up there and they're going to make comments like, I would like to meet Margaret Thatcher, who is the racist and who's the warmonger, then what are they there for?
I can't defend that. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, if I was going to list somebody from Britain I wanted to meet, she would not be on my list. I mean, and I don't want to, I would really love to know what she was thinking there. Again, I can't defend that. I would have hoped she might say somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, and she might have thought that ultimately, but it reminds me of where we started the interview when you were talking about Jamal and Colin Powell. People have their idiosyncratic, like I really look up to Russ Feingold. He's somebody who, and Mike Gravel, who's no longer with us, like they were former senators who played very key roles in challenging executive power. And, I can't imagine a world in which either of them would look particularly conservative because they both were sort of leading lights of their respective eras. But, when you put somebody on that pedestal and you look up to them, maybe it's hard to see their dark sides. I do the same thing that I said about Jamal, I would say about Ilhan. I think that it's important if you're going to shout somebody out like that to note the reality of their record. And you're absolutely right about Margaret Thatcher's history as an agent of imperialism. And especially, when I look at Ilhan, the thing that jumps out at me as also someone with roots outside this country is that she's risen to make national policy as herself having come from the most marginalized communities. I mean, refugees are people who are literally like chased from their homes for all intents and purposes. And it's incredibly poignant and powerful from that background to get where she has. And I would hope that that perspective would incline her to recognize any opportunity for people to be marginalized. And in her defense, she generally does. I mean, the two jobs of members of Congress are oversight and legislation. And so who she shouts out when people ask her, who is the British person you might want to meet? Like, yes, I wish she would choose somebody better. But when I look at her oversight, I see her interrogating Elliot Abrams, who was the architect of Reagan era human rights abuses across Latin America, and then Trump's envoy to Venezuela. Nobody else in Congress did that. It took Ilhan to drag him in public. And I see her legislation. She's the one who developed the Cancel Rents and Mortgages Act. This was a bill that during the pandemic would have suspended all payments for rents and mortgages and required banks to pay the costs of housing. That's real. That's how she's showing up. That's how she's using her power in office. And she uses her, social media bully pulpit also to shout out progressive issues. And like, I totally get that there are moments we could be disappointed in her. And I would wish she might shout out anybody other than Margaret Thatcher, clearly. But at the same time, I see the work she's doing in Washington. And from where I am standing, and I take plenty of heat, I take a tenth of the heat that Ilhan does. You should see the comments on anything she posts. I mean, it's wild. And I see her as a leader, and she does incredible work. And again, there are points where I think any of them are going to disappoint us at some point. But I see her and Corey in a league of their own. I mean, if the squad is the squad, I wish there was some word for a smaller unit that was just the two of them, because Corey coming off the street and being willing to embrace extra legal activism and direct action, like that's a history I share. And Ilhan as a legislator with a foot outside the United States in terms of her own personal history, that's another thing I relate to. So I relate to each of the two of them in a very different way than I do to the others. Most of them came to Congress by having some position of local authority. And those of us who did not, I think there's also a difference there, right? When you have city council people who run for Congress, they're different animals than when you have street activists who do it, right? And then there's a profound difference that this is worth making clear. In some respects, the members of the squad couldn't be more opposite, because on the one hand, politicians are people who do things that are popular. We were talking before about Kamala being something of a weather vane, right? In a way that might be reflective of popular opinion and contriving her own positions to match it. That's what politicians do. Advocates are the inverse. We don't particularly care what's popular. I have no interest in what's popular. I just do what's right, and I argue for it. And it just so happens that over the last 20 years, more and more people have figured it out. And I see Ilhan and Corey like that. They don't care if defund the police is a popular slogan. It's not a slogan. It's a demand of people who've been getting preyed on by paid public servants. And we're not here for that. And, white liberals and moderates can say whatever they want about if it's a compelling slogan to them and the polling data. And I really don't care. The evidence is clear. Police don't keep us safe. Why are we investing public dollars in them? Let's put that money in places where it would do more good. It's not that complicated. But, for people who are all about popularity, this becomes a very challenging question, and there's, again, a difference between people who approach politics as a career or a game instead of an exercise in collective liberation. And if your approach to it is the latter, frankly, the path reveals itself quite clearly. It's not nearly as complicated as I think many people would seem to think.
So in reference to KRTD's question, sorry, 1 second. In reference to KRTD's question, would you be willing to endorse a third party candidate if they were running against a Democrat, whether it's like on a local election as well?
Absolutely. For Congress too. I mean, again, I'm no Democrat. Like I am a former Green who is running as a Democrat to remove the head of the party. So like, yes, absolutely. I would be very eager to find, I don't want to say every candidate because that's not the right posture, but like, yeah, when there are a third party, I'm very eager to see third and minor parties establish a footprint in this country. Ultimately, it's hard to say that without also acknowledging the crucial need for election reform to make that possible. Things like ranked choice voting, things like public finance for elections, things that would, policies and reforms that would level the partisan playing field. And it's worth, as long as we're having that conversation, to note that HR 1, which would dramatically expand and improve voting rights, would at the same time be actively counterproductive in that particular dimension by widening the gap between the parties and increasing barriers to entry for small ones. There's a lot to say here about first past the post election, the relationship between election design and party centralization. There's a French political scientist from the 50s, Maurice Duverger, who sort of established this theorem about first past the post elections necessarily inviting dualization in the political spectrum. And we certainly have seen that demonstrated and proven any number of times in the United States. If I may, just as long as we're on this question about third parties. So yes, I'm very happy to endorse third party candidates. A lot of people pretend that running third party in some way will insulate you from the attacks that come on Democrats who challenge incumbents. For instance, like I've heard critiques of Bernie for running as a Democrat, for instance, or in the Democratic primary as an independent. And the fact of the matter is, if you run as an independent, or if you run as a Green, or you run as a third party candidate, you can avoid some of the spaces where there are Democrats, but it also means that you are in spaces where there are just a lot less people. And this is sort of a function of the existing duopoly, I should say, and its unfortunate consequences. If we mean to contend for seats in the current time slice, we have to confront the landscape as we find it, as we work to cultivate a better one. And again, that's part of why I'm very eager to discover and structurally shift the process to be more inviting to third and minor parties. I think that ultimately is the more meaningful way to support them.
Yeah, so Cynthia McKinney was here recently, and
Oh,
she was
wow.
talking about how, yeah, like she was such a joy.
She was about it.
I think sometimes you think that when you're gonna meet like uh politicians or former politicians, I guess like you get this idea of them in your head that they're going to be like, you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about. And I met her and she was just so like chill. Like, you know what I mean? So but she was saying that she said that none of the 535 that are there are willing to go for the mat. And I think from her experience, what she found is that she pushed back a lot, like when she was in office. And
Yeah, she did.
in turn, they kind of pushed her out. And my question to you is, what if that happens? Like for you, like what if you get
I'd
in
love to
there,
get pushed out.
you love to get pushed out?
Well, I mean, the whole point is like my dream is to read into the congressional record some classified document to stop a war. Like that's why I'm running, is to stop a war and to do whatever I need to do it. And if that costs me a seat, like great. I would love for that to be my legacy. Nothing would make me happier. I look at Mike Gravel as sort of like the apex of what a legislator can do. It's one reason I'm so honored by his endorsement before he passed away. He was the constitutional conscience of Congress in his era, and Congress doesn't have one today. And I would be honored to play that role. And that role requires putting the principles before yourself. It's all I've ever done. I've never put myself before principles, and I'm not inclined to start now. Again, I'm not a politician, right? I'm an advocate. It's the same thing as when we look at these, where Cynthia would throw, it sounds like maybe Ilhan and Corey under the same sort of like category as everyone else. I do see a distinction there. I see Corey's willingness to take extra legal action. That in itself is a big difference between people who limit themselves to their institutional prerogatives and people who recognize their roles as thought leaders and the potential value of direct action in forcing a conversation. When you put that kind of willingness behind someone with a presence like a member of Congress in the squad with the viral, social and other media attention that they have, Corey has profound influence that she has developed by using extra legal mechanisms. That's different than many of her colleagues. And to Ilhan's credit, I didn't see anybody else legislate a bill that was going to cancel rent and mortgage payments. She had other co-sponsors, but she was the lead on that measure. And that one, to me, the idea of in the middle of a pandemic, just saying, there's this housing crisis happening. It's entirely predictable. We're just going to put this on the banks. That's a profound vision. And when I see people putting out visions like that and people taking the kind of steps that Corey did, I have a hard time of putting them in the same bucket as everybody else. But again, and I don't want to speak for either of them. I can't, so I'm not going to. But I would just say that if I were to have the opportunity to follow their footsteps and endure the same result that Representative McKinney did, I would be very proud of that. It's why I'm proud of last year's race, even though we didn't liberate the seat. We won 6 different policies through the House of Representatives. Like, I had more influence over federal policy than I possibly could have as a freshman member of Congress, just as the challenger to the Speaker of the House. And That's a win to me. Like, it bloodied me profoundly, but we won a bunch of policies. That's what I'm here for. That's a win. And whatever happens to the careers of the people, like, I'm not interested in my career. I'm not here for that. But I'm here to try to get some people some healthcare, and I'm particularly here to try to stop a war.
So I know you've done a lot of activism. What advice would you give to people who are looking to get into activism, whether it's through direct action, whether it's through mutual aid, and how can they do so safely? And for those who cannot physically go out, they just can't physically like go out and protest for whatever reasons, how can they get involved?
So the safely part and how to do it from behind a computer, those are both parts that I'm going to struggle with, but I'll answer the first part of your question. My first answer is show up. Because I think when you show up in a space where people are already organizing around concerns that you share, you're going to learn all kinds of things. You're going to learn whatever you didn't learn from the news article that you read or the podcast discussion that you listened to. You're going to learn how it impacts your community. You're going to learn the people who are active on it in your neighborhood. And so there really is no substitute for showing up. I don't think there is one. And it's one reason why the pandemic, I think, is so challenging, because it makes it harder to show up, right? In the act, and there are virtual ways of showing up, like many organizations that used to host in-person meetings might be doing like virtual ones online. Show up for those. Show up in your community for people organizing around the issues that you care about, and it will unlock other opportunities. That's among the ways that we helped establish the first limits on surveillance in this country, were by grassroots organizing at the local level to politicize local police policies. I would like to say that's how we got marriage equality, though. And that there was a piece of it. Frankly, it was my role in that struggle was almost the inverse of community organizing, because it was in the courts, which is the opposite. It's quintessentially not grassroots. But after we started filing cases, a bunch of people in the grassroots started organizing, and I frankly think that's ultimately what begat the cultural shift that forced the Supreme Court and the Obergefell decision to establish marriage equality as a national right. So the grassroots organizing is always critical, even if the process seems to be getting mediated through institutional channels. So show up, connect with your neighbors. Another principle here, I would say, that gets lost in the equation, and this is more relevant for advocacy than for the other arenas, though. For direct action, it's relevant also, maybe less so for mutual aid. In the articulation of demands, there is a challenge in terms of recognizing the water in which we swim. So it is often the case when people articulate demands, either for a direct action or for even an electoral campaign or a policy initiative, they're very limited in their construction of what the vision might be. This is why I'm so proud of Ilhan in the Cancel Rents and Mortgages Act. Like, she saw beyond the current time slice, to look beyond what is, to understand what can be. There is profound creativity in that act, and it is crucial, and it is often completely ignored even by people who do see fit to activate. So looking beyond the current time slice is a thing that I would say beyond, show up, look beyond right now. And I would also say bend conversations about concerns towards some construction. It's really easy to fall into gripe sessions. There's so much stuff to gripe about, right? But make sure when you're in that conversation of critique to include some reference to what you can do about it. In any setting, there's something you can do. It might be minuscule, it might be ephemeral, it might require help from other people, but to skip over what is the action imperative allows whatever the object of your critique is to persist. And so this is my concern with the electoral nihilism. It seems like a self-feeding, vicious discourse that internalizes political impotence from a set of facts that, frankly, if anything, indicate grand efficacy. We are actually gaining ground. And it might not feel very fast, but if you've been doing this work for a long time, it actually is happening a lot faster than many of us thought. And it's important to recognize that and to feed into those narratives of construction. So what do we do now that we have a few voices in Congress that may or may not be reliable on everything, but there's at least a toehold? What do we do as a movement when we want to put other things in play? Going back a few minutes in the conversation, you mentioned the need for a general strike. It's a great example of this. I see so many people correctly today investing energy in mutual aid networks and organizing, recognizing the capacity that builds to do things like assertive, widespread work stoppage, right? And that's really encouraging. We need more of that. And I think for people who dismiss the progress of our movement, they don't recognize how much further we are in that endeavor than we were 3 years ago. I mean, in some respects, the pandemic has been a profound gift, because a lot of the mutual aid organizing that's popped off in the last year has been responding to the pandemic. It also, frankly, is building much greater resiliency for labor. I wonder if many of the work stoppages that are sweeping the country would be possible without those mutual aid networks, for instance. We might be already recognizing, or pardon me, already witnessing the predictable consequences of that layer of organizing starting to take root. So don't then throw your hands up in the air and say it's hopeless. Like, it's actually working. These are victories that we should be celebrating and doubling down on to accelerate, rather than walking away claiming falsely that we have no tools and that we're all going to die in 10 years. Like, I would, if that's going to happen, I'm certainly going to go down on my feet. And that entails all of us organizing in all the different ways that we can.
So for me, I don't think it's so much nihilism. I see it more as a sense of urgency. There are some of us that we just can't wait much longer. We can't wait for another election to get health insurance. We can't wait for another election to get rid of this student loan debt, which is astronomical at this point. For millennials, for Gen Z, it just gets worse and worse. For some of us, we just can't wait for another election or to elect another person and hope that when they get in, they're going to do what they said they're going to do. And when the pandemic came, again, that really escalated things for us. A lot of people lost their jobs. I watched a lot of mom and pop places around me close, and these people have no money. And some of them had no savings because they were barely making enough to get by to begin with. So that is one thing I do want to say, is that
That's real.
I think it's a sense of urgency for some of us. Like, we've played this game for so long. It's like, I mean, I'm going all the way back to Obama was the first time I was disappointed. And every time I thought there was more hope. I thought there'd be hope with Bernie, and then Bernie didn't get in. I watched the way the DNC tried to play him. I watched that whole debacle. They did it to him twice. And then Bernie becomes, he's in charge of the budget. And so I'm like, okay, wait a minute. He's in charge of the money. This is going to be the moment. Maybe this is a good thing after all. And then he's going on to Crystal and Kyle, without Kyle, by the way. That's a whole nother story. But he goes on to Crystal and Kyle and tells Crystal that Joe Biden's doing a good job. He tells Crystal that Joe Biden can't cancel student loan debt. That's not true. So now I'm seeing Bernie do the same thing. So that's just something I'm like, I'm not angry at you. It's just, I just want to explain to you, like, why people are so upset.
I get it. And the urgency piece, just to be clear, like I have $50,000 in student debt myself. I've averaged, my compensation over my congressional campaigns has been $30,000 a year. I understand what you're describing. I've been homeless before. And I think that how do I put this? The translation of urgency into action that's a good thing. The translation of urgency into inaction is a problem. And so the more that we take that urgency and let it fuel our organizing and our outreach and our activation, whether it's in mutual aid, whether it's in policy advocacy, direct action, electoral campaigns, wherever the interest goes, I actually don't even care, as long as people take action on their convictions instead of, throwing, wet sand on everyone's fire. I think that when I look at Bernie making the comment about Biden, a layer here just to grip is there's an intra-movement conversation, and then there's a conversation with the public, right? We in the movement pay a lot more attention than most people in the public. One of the things that I hear Bernie saying when he says Joe Biden is, and I've heard other people, like, for instance, in the squad, AOC's made like encouraging statements about Biden. And I want to put it this way: based on Joe Biden's history before he ran for president, I expected him to legislate more or less like Trump. And on some issues like immigration, he has. On others, like Afghanistan, he managed to, and to Trump's, I'm not going to say credit, but you might remember that Trump tried to stop the war in Afghanistan too. And the idea that it took Joe Biden to end the war in Afghanistan is bizarre. It's like Nixon going to China, right? And this is one of the rules in Washington, is that often it takes unlikely bedfellows to move forward policies that you wouldn't expect them to. And so not just the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The thing I would give Biden credit for is his judicial appointments and appointing Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commission. Those are huge movement victories. Lena Khan is the first federal trade enforcer in a generation to come in with a pro-enforcement attitude. For that to come from Biden, I would never have expected it. Another way to think of that is that even if Bernie didn't win the election, we won a bunch of things. And I didn't think this was when Bernie was talking about his friend Joe Biden, I did not expect Biden to give Bernie any actual nods, either in appointments or in policy. I have frankly been amazed at how many of those nods have actually emerged. You saw some of them in the budget reconciliation bill, not nearly enough, right? I mean, Bernie started out in his presidential campaign at like 12 trillion. And then that got whittled down to 3.5, and now Biden is receding even from that. So it's not nearly enough by far, but it's way beyond where Joe started. And again, when Bernie says on Crystal's show that, Biden's showing up, the point of that's not a message to the movement, because we all know he's not showing up. That's a message to the public saying we, the movement, are setting the agenda. And that's the important point here. More important than is Joe showing up or not is the point that we are setting the agenda. And again, I would like it to be a stronger reflection of where Bernie was at. And I think our job in this time slice is to make sure that the next round is closer to that. And I totally feel all the urgency. It's all the reason that we should all be full tilt in. It's the reason why I, work my fingers to the bone on this particular struggle, is I see how crucial this particular seat has been in driving so many problematic outcomes. And so that's why I'm particularly focused on it. I think, wherever we are situated, there is something very compelling that we can each be working on. And hopefully we can all be engaged in each of the different pieces. My mutual aid project is gardening. I give out free plants to support pollinators to people who keep bees and have gardens. And there's no reason we can't all be active across all of the different fronts, right? And so that's kind of the point of movement organizing, is to be active in different organizations that give you a chance as an individual to express yourself through policy advocacy, to express yourself through direct action when the occasion requires or when the opportunity presents itself, to express yourself also electorally. And I'll pull back the characterization of nihilism, because I appreciate your reframing of that. I think it's just the impetus towards inaction that I find challenging and self-marginalizing. And I would just invite all of us who might incorporate a critique of the voices in Washington to take whatever critique we are channeling and put that into action that will shift the future. We're not just on. This is my grand problem with it. I see a lot of people treat Bernie or AOC or the squad as if we are observers of a film that we're watching, but we're not observers. We construct this, all of us do. And there's no reason to be so self-marginalizing as to descend into mere critique of someone else instead of doing something to shift it. That is the invitation here. And I see so many people doing things in a variety of ways across this country. And that's where I put my energy, is in the activation and construction of a better tomorrow. And that requires critiquing today, but I don't get lost in the critique. And I think a lot of times the critique can be beguiling, because frankly, it's a lot easier than building. And so we have to critique, but we have to get past it too. And just going back to I don't remember exactly when this question came up, but about the guidance to organizers, showing up, looking beyond the current time slice, and this point of redoubling action and privileging action and looking at ways to encourage it, as opposed to falling into the trap of critique with no follow-up.
One more question for you, because last time that you were here, you mentioned something. I've been telling people that I think that local politics is more important than people think, and that these positions such as city councilor, running for mayor, these aren't small positions. I know it's not like a big title like, senator or something like that, but these positions are inherently important. And one of the things you said last time you were here is that running for office should never be your first thing. For people who there's a lot of new subscribers now. For people who are new, can you explain why that should never be your first thing?
Right on. I appreciate you remembering that too. The point of wielding office is to help your community make better decisions. And if you haven't had the chance to force it to make some better decisions, you might not know how to make better decisions. You might have some senses of policies that you'd prefer, but the political process is more complicated than that. And so I do think of the the development of qualifications to serve as inhering in taking the action necessary to shift the political equation. The reason I ran for office is that I helped establish a new right for consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice, and I helped secure the first limits on the surveillance state at the local level in a number of jurisdictions across the country. Like, I don't think I would be qualified to represent anywhere if I hadn't had the opportunity to secure some things like that. And, into each of those projects and all the other ones I've done go a lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of meetings. Like, all of those things build your capacity to be of service. There's another piece here in terms of legitimacy. If you're running and you haven't done work organizing before, you might simply be answering only to yourself. But if you've done organizing, you're answerable to the communities that you've organized in. I've organized around the country. I'm answerable to the people that I've organized with. And that's a similar principle. It's about accountability. It's about legitimacy. And it's also really about preparing yourself to actually be helpful when you have, hopefully, your hand on a pen where you can cast some votes. And as to the local national piece, for what it's worth, like being a city councilor, being a mayor, those are huge titles. And people forget this. The more local the jurisdictional unit, the more empowered you are. Yeah. Members of Congress, this is one of the points I was trying to raise about the squad. Members of Congress, each one, they cast the voting strength equal to 0.25% in the body. They are infinitesimally empowered. And it's by design. Right? Mm-hmm. There's a whole other layer of this constitutionally. Congress has only enumerated powers, meaning that there's a lot of stuff Congress cannot do that the courts will intervene if it tries. State legislatures, in contrast, have plenary power. They are unconstrained. The most powerful positions in politics are state legislative positions. And at the local level, you're basically invested with the authority of the state unit. So the smaller the jurisdictional unit, the more flexible, the more you can actually do to help. The only reason I'm running for Congress and not a local office is that I've spent 20 years fighting Congress. Like, that's the landscape I know. Now, I was in Washington for 10 years and I led a national nonprofit. So I frankly don't know the issues before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors half as well as I do before the issues before the House. When I've organized civil rights coalitions to force issues into policy, it wasn't at the Board of Supervisors and it wasn't in Sacramento. It was before the judiciary committees in the House and the Senate. So that's the landscape where I am prepared to be helpful. And that's why I'm running for that seat.
All right, Shahid, thanks so much for coming back on. I know there was some tough questions in there, but thanks so much.
They were great. It was great to be with you, and your audience is awesome. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon.
Bye.
Bye, Sabby.
All right, guys. Where am I here? Okay. All right, guys. I'm actually not going to keep you much longer because Red Sox are on tonight and they are playing against the Astros. It is tied 1-1 in the series. So let's keep that momentum going. Let's win this game so we can have it 2-1. Let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. So I do want to watch that game. I'm going to have to try to watch that game and have FHL on my phone because FHL Roundtable is also on right now. We're trying this new thing where we do 2 roundtables because some people can make it on Thursday and some people cannot make it on Thursday. So there is a roundtable tonight. I know they're going to be talking about Colin Powell. Go check that out. If you're into baseball, go check out the Sox and the Astros playing tonight. Either way, have a good night. Keep up the fight.